Racist woman stole Big Shaq's puppy thinking he was trespassing. But the moment she tried to turn the street against him, the truth flipped louder than her lies. No shouting, no revenge, just one man, one missing dog, and a plan that backfired harder than she ever imagined. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Mornings in Rockland Drive. Don't begin with alarm clocks. They start with the soft padding of size 22 sneakers on dew-speckled pavement, the quiet jingle of a collar, and the low hum of a man humming Al Green under his breath. That's how the street knows the day has begun. When Big Shaq steps out of his modest gray brick home with a leash in one hand, a coffee mug in the other, and his golden retriever, Kingston, wagging his tail like it's a metronome for joy. Shaquille O'Neal is a name people recognize from 100 headlines, trophies, and endorsements. But on Rockland Drive, he's not Shaquille the icon. He's just Shaq, or Big Shaq, if you're a kid with a basketball and a dream. Out here, nobody cares about NBA stats or shoe lines. What they care about is that Shaq helped fix Miss Rowley's porch last fall, paid for Bobby, the mailman's, job to get braces, and once stood in line at the grocery store just to buy cookies from a nervous little girl who stammered her way through a Girl Scout pitch. Every morning, he takes the same path. Past the Weatherby's hydrangeas, which he always compliments, past Mr. Hicks's busted mailbox, which he keeps meaning to fix, and down to the end of the block where the sun hits the street in that perfect way that makes it look like gold dust drifting in the air. Kingston trots ahead, ears perked, sniffing curiously at lampposts and fences like every morning's brand new. The dog's his shadow, his buddy, and the last living link to the shelter where Shaq donated enough money to rebuild their wing in Kingston's name. Rockland Drive is a mosaic of lives stitched together by proximity and morning routines. There's no HOA, no neighborhood watch, just an understanding, unspoken, but alive, that kindness is the currency, that helping one another is expected. Shaq doesn't make speeches about it. He lives it, quietly, consistently. If someone's trash bin tips over in the wind, Shaq picks it up. If someone's car won't start, he's under the hood before AAA even rings back. It's the kind of place where kids draw hopscotch squares in pastel chalk, and people still wave at each other from porches. But not every house plays along. On the corner of Rockland Drive and Maple Cross stands a house with old colonial bones and newer security cameras perched like vultures. The lawn is perfect, almost unnaturally so, and the shutters look like they've never seen a speck of dust. But the blinds? Always closed. The window? Always locked. And the woman inside? Rarely seen, never smiling. Her name, whispered more than spoken, is Mrs. Delaney Voss. Nobody remembers exactly when she moved in. Some say she's been there 20 years. Others claim she arrived just after her husband, a former police chief, passed. All anyone knows for certain is that she doesn't speak much, doesn't wave, and definitely doesn't like dogs. The first time Shaq passed her house, Kingston barked once, playful, tail wagging. A moment later, the blinds trembled like a curtain of suspicion, and from behind them a narrow eye glared down the driveway. That was the only time they'd met. From that day on, Shaq always kept his distance, still nodded, still smiled. But the gesture was never returned. Delaney Voss never spoke at block parties, never opened the door for trick-or-treaters, and never picked up a package from her porch without first checking the cameras. To the rest of Rockland, she was a cautionary tale in flesh, someone grief had calcified into steel. But if Rockland Drive taught you anything, it was this: you treat even the hardest people soft, because you don't know what made them that way. Shaq never mentioned her to the others, never gossiped, never rolled his eyes when she pulled her curtain shut at the sight of Kingston, sniffing too close to her hedges. He just said the same thing every time he passed her gate. "Mornin', boss."
Not sarcastic. Not mocking. Just warm. The way he said it to everyone else.
That's how Shaq lived his days. Like each one was a favor the world gave him, and he owed it kindness in return. After his walk, he'd return to his house, the one with the wooden bench he built himself under the oak tree, and sit for a while with Kingston at his feet. People passing by always waved. Some stopped to talk, some just nodded, and every so often, a kid would toss a ball over the fence just for a chance to hear the legend say, "Nice throw, lil' boss." His garage wasn't full of cars, just tools. His backyard wasn't for parties, just peace. Sometimes music drifted from the windows. Miles Davis, Nina Simone, Marvin Gaye. Sometimes laughter when a niece visited, or a cousin from Georgia came through. But more often it was quiet. The kind of quiet earned through a life lived loud, and now treasured for its stillness. That was Shaq's world. Simple, tender, generous, and yet something in the air had shifted. It was slight, subtle, but present. It began with little things. A newspaper missing from his porch. A car slowing too long outside his house. A glare from the corner house that felt colder than usual. Kingston had started barking at night. Not wildly. Just enough to suggest he knew something Shaq didn't. One morning, just as Shaq reached the corner and said his usual, "Mornin', boss," he noticed something different. The curtain twitched. As always, but this time, a phone lifted up behind the glass. Click. A picture was taken. It wasn't just the usual disapproval anymore. It felt like documentation, like the moment had been filed, stored, weaponized for a future event, not yet written. Shaq stood still for a moment longer than usual. Kingston whined softly, sensing the stillness in his owner's body. Shaq gave a small nod, the smile still on his face but fainter. Quiet. He turned around and headed home, eyes lingering just a moment on the corner house. There are different kinds of danger in the world. Some roar, others whisper, but the most dangerous kind. The kind that watches. And somewhere behind the drawn blinds, Delaney Voss was watching. Her hands steady, her mouth tight, a plan forming in silence. Rockland Drive was about to be tested, and Shaq, the man who had always chosen peace, would soon have to decide how far grace could stretch before it snapped. But for now, the sun still glowed over Rockland Drive, still painted the street gold, still warmed the skin of a gentle giant, walking a loyal pup, still made people believe everything was all right. For now, Shaq felt it the first time he turned the corner onto Mulberry Lane. That invisible pressure on his shoulders, the kind that made you want to check if someone was behind you, even when you were dead certain they weren't. The street was quiet, lined with clipped hedges and perfect porches, but house number 11 stood out, not because it was ugly. It wasn't. In fact, it was immaculate. Too immaculate. The paint didn't flake, the lawn was suspiciously green year-round, and the windows always gleamed. But one window in particular, the upper right, second floor, held a presence. It was like a set of eyes watching you from inside a mask. That's where she lived. Mrs. Delaney Voss. Old money met old bitterness in that house. Widowed nearly 10 years ago, she kept her husband's photo on the wall like it was a warning label, not a memory. Chief Randall Voss, local legend, hardliner, feared by many. The man who believed silence was order, and order was law. Shaq had learned her name from the mail carrier. A whisper, like passing on the name of a ghost. "She don't like footsteps," the mailman said, his voice low, "especially not your footsteps." Shaq didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. Every time he passed, her curtain twitched. Not dramatically, not like in movies, just enough to let you know someone saw, just enough to say you're being watched. Sometimes she'd be there, face stiff as the shutters, her gray hair pulled back tight, eyes narrowed like she was trying to recognize a crime that hadn't happened yet. Then came the whispers. "Trespassing," she muttered the third time Shaq passed on the public sidewalk. Her voice rough and tight like gravel crushed in a fist, barely carried through the hydrangeas lining the fence. He turned, confused. "Sorry?" Her lips twitched but didn't part again. She just stood there in her pressed beige cardigan, arms folded, eyes never blinking. It was always the same after that. Every afternoon walk with the puppy, Nino, a soft, excitable little fluff ball, turned into a silent standoff. Delaney Voss on her porch. Shaq pretending not to notice. Nino sniffing grass, oblivious. Then came the camera. It started small, a black dome tucked under the eave, angled sharply at the street. Shaq noticed it one morning when the sun hit the lens just right, the glint catching his eye. A week later, there were 3 more. All of them faced his house. None angled toward the street corner, the mailbox or her own property. Just his. The city code said she had the right. Public sidewalk. No privacy there. Still, the intent clung to it like mold. She was watching. Nino barked once at her gate. Just once. And the next day there was a sign on her fence. No loitering. No dogs. The letters were black. Bold. Sharp as knives. Shaq could have let it go. Should have. But something about the sign, the cameras, the narrowed eyes, it all felt like a line being crossed one quiet inch at a time. So he walked slower, deliberate, calm, right past her house every morning and evening. He never looked directly at her. He didn't need to. She watched. One morning, Shaq opened his door and found a photograph in his mailbox. Not a letter, not a note. A glossy, 5x7 photo. It was him, holding Nina, outside her house, taken from above, that upper window. He stared at it for a long time. The composition was deliberate. Clean. He was centered. The colors vivid. Her signature scrawl, red ink, across the bottom. You don't belong here. No stamp. No envelope. She'd walked across the street and placed it there herself. Shaq didn't sleep that night. He kept the blinds open, sat on the couch in the dark, watching, wondering if she'd do something more. But nothing moved. Not until 4:17 a.m., when a flash of light flickered in the corner window. Not lightning. Not a car. A camera. Click. Just once. The photo came 2 days later. Slid under his door this time. Him through his window, reading. A still from his living room. And that's when he realized. She wasn't just watching. She was documenting. He took the photo to the local precinct, but they shrugged. No crime here, the officer said. Eyes already back on his paperwork. Just an eccentric neighbor. Shaq left feeling smaller than he had going in. Back on Mulberry Lane. Delaney was watering her plants, the hose curved like a snake in her hands. She didn't look at him. Didn't have to. Her mouth curled into something that might have been a smile. He installed curtains. She adjusted her cameras. Every time he tried to talk to a neighbor about her, they brushed it off. She's been through a lot, one said. Her husband was a hero. She's just scared, said another. You know how it is, people get stuck in their ways. He knew what they meant. And yet, one rainy afternoon, Nino slipped the leash and ran toward her yard. Just a few feet, wet paws tapping across the sidewalk. Shaq chased after him, heart pounding. Delaney was already at the window, camera in hand. Snap. That evening, a new photo appeared. This one was different, not printed. It was hand-drawn, charcoal on heavy stock. Nino sketched in sharp lines, body mid-leap. Behind him, a shadowy figure loomed, distorted, almost monstrous. She'd made Shaq a villain in her art. His hands trembled. Not from fear. From something harder to name. The next morning, her gate was chained shut. A lock hung from it, like a padlocked mouth. But that wasn't what chilled him. It was the new camera. This one on a movable arm. It followed motion. It tracked. He tested it once. Walked past slow, then fast, then doubled back. The lens followed every time. That night it rained again. He dreamed of clicking shutters and silent screams. And when he woke, there was another drawing at his doorstep. But this time, he wasn't in it. Nino was alone. And behind him, in the upper window of a house that looked a lot like Delaney's, two hollow eyes stared out. He didn't sleep after that. 2 days passed without incident. Then a third. The cameras didn't move. Delaney wasn't on the porch. The curtains stayed drawn. On the fourth day, her porch light flickered on, then off, then on again. Shaq watched from his window. Then he saw it. A flash. Not from a camera this time. From a lighter. A brief spark of flame, near the base of one of the rose bushes. Then it was gone. The next morning, the rose bush was scorched, bare blackened branches like skeletal fingers, and beside it, driven into the soil, a wooden stake. With another photo.
Nino again.
But this one was older. From weeks ago. The puppy asleep in the grass. Vulnerable. Peaceful. And beneath it, her words in that same red ink. Some things don't belong in this neighborhood. He called the HOA. They said they'd look into it. He called the city. They took a report. But Delaney wasn't arrested. Wasn't questioned. She was still there. Behind the blinds. Watch. Her obsession was quiet. For now. But the blinds were opening wider. And her focus, sharper. He could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. Not loud, not sudden, but inevitable. And close. It was a Tuesday. Warm, ordinary, forgettable. One of those days that slips through the cracks of memory, if not for something sudden, something that snaps the spine of routine in half. Shaq had let Kingston out into the yard just before noon. The sun was high but veiled in thin clouds, the kind that dulled shadows and made everything feel a little softer. He watched from the kitchen window as the puppy pranced across the grass, tail swishing, nose buried in every scent like it was the first time he'd ever smelled spring. The gate was locked. As always. The camera above it blinked a silent red light, recording secure. Shaq poured himself coffee, took one sip, and leaned on the counter. A 5-minute break. That's all it was. But when he stepped back out, cup still warm in hand, Kingston was gone. No bark, no whimper, no paw prints in the soil. Just gone. His chest hollowed instantly. That sick drop in your gut, like missing a step in the dark. He called once. Then again, louder. Sharper. Kingston.
Nothing.
He checked the gate. Still locked. Chain tight. No signs of tampering. The yard was enclosed. Fenced from all sides. 6 feet high, no space for a golden retriever to squeeze through. Especially not one with a collar and a limp in his back leg from a healed fracture. Shaq sprinted to the front. Looked down both sides of Mulberry Lane. No dog. No leash dragging. No door ajar where a curious puppy might have wandered. Only the neighbors. And Delaney Voss. She was on her porch, as always. This time seated, a delicate porcelain cup raised to her lips, steam curling around her expressionless face. But when she noticed him looking, she smiled. A slow, controlled lift of her lips. Not joy, not kindness, something closer to satisfaction. It pierced him. He turned, kicked off down the street, knocking on doors, calling out, waving photos on his phone. Most neighbors knew Kingston. They adored him, the soft-eyed retriever with the goofy gait and a bark barely louder than a sigh. People came out of their homes. A few joined the search. A teen on a bike combed the side streets. 2 elderly women scoured the park near the school. Time stuttered. The sun dipped low without warning. Still nothing. Shaq's front lawn, once bright and clean, turned into a makeshift station, flyers taped to a streetlight, a folding table with a missing dog sign propped up beside a bowl of untouched kibble. He hadn't cried yet. Not really, but he hadn't stopped shaking either. By evening, the entire neighborhood buzzed with anxiety. Kingston wasn't just a dog. He was Shaq's dog. Rescued. Trained. Loved out of his trauma. Everyone had seen him soften since Kingston arrived. The way his voice warmed when he called how his posture had changed, from guarded to open. Like he was learning to breathe again. And now that breath had been stolen. Someone mentioned cameras. Shaq nodded. Of course. He checked his own footage first. Rewound. Watched the dog sniff the grass. Wander near the back hedge. And then nothing. No escape. No glitch. Just a subtle skip between frames. 10 seconds lost. A cut. He stared at the screen. Replayed it 5 times. Same skip. Same sudden shift. And Kingston gone. His stomach dropped again. He took the footage to the local tech repair shop. The guy there leaned back in his chair, furrowed his brow, then leaned in again. You got interference, he muttered. Like someone jammed the signal for a second. Deliberate. Shaq blinked. You mean somebody knew how to avoid your camera? It was a small town. Not the kind of place where people disappeared, especially not dogs. He walked back, tension twisting his insides like rope. Delaney's porch light flicked on as he neared her house. She was still there. Still sipping her tea. Same cup. Same expression. This time she spoke. I suppose some animals just wander. Shaq stopped cold. What did you say? She stood. Strolled to the edge of her porch. No fear in her. No guilt. Nothing, she said, voice sweet as wrought. Just that some creatures have a way of getting lost, even when they're fenced in. He stared at her. Long. Silent. Trying to find the crack. But Delaney Voss had no cracks. Only polished porcelain edges, and the chill of a lifetime hardened into ritual. He turned away, but her words followed like smoke. Inside, the silence was unbearable. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a bark that never came. He sat on the couch, phone in hand, watching the time pass. No calls, no sightings. He checked the footage again. Zoomed in on the hedge. Kingston had wandered near. Behind it, across the property line, barely visible, was Delaney's garden wall. The hedge was planted there years ago. He'd never looked closely, but now, in frame-by-frame inspection, he noticed something. A gap in the soil. A divot. like something had moved through, or someone had reached under. He went outside with a flashlight, hands trembling. At the back of the yard, near the hedge, the soil had been disturbed, the grass flattened, barely, not visible to a passing glance, but unmistakable up close. And there, buried under the edge of the fence, a string, tied in a loose noose. The kind you could slip around a collar. He picked it up slowly, and that's when the panic gave way to something colder. Resolve. The next morning, he went to the police again, handed them the string, showed them the footage, filed a formal report. They nodded, took notes, promised to investigate. But Delaney was still there when he returned home, still sipping tea. And this time, a sketchbook lay on her lap. She was drawing. He couldn't see what. Didn't want to. He walked straight inside, locked the door, and sat in the silence. The food bowl stayed full, the leash untouched. Even the couch felt emptier. The smell of dog still lingered in the cushions, but it faded a little more each hour. He didn't cry that night either, just sat there, listening, hoping. But there was no bark, no scratch at the door, only wind. And across the street, behind the blinds, a flicker of light, then darkness. The porch stayed empty the next day. No Delaney, no tea, but something had changed. On the sidewalk in front of her gate, a chalk drawing had appeared. Childlike. Crooked. A golden retriever. No words, just the image. Shaq stared at it for a long time, and when he looked up, the curtains twitched. The house behind the blinds watched him back. Not with fear, but patience, as if waiting for something else. Something worse. He picked up the chalk piece broken in half beside the drawing, and turned it over in his hand. And for the first time in days, his face hardened. Because if Delaney Voss thought the game was over, she didn't know Shaq. Not yet. He didn't sleep after that. The next morning, he went to the city records office, searched through permits and blueprints, found Delaney's house filed under Voss, 1983. The basement was standard, nothing unusual on paper, but the notes from 1991 showed a renovation, foundation adjustment, approved for a storm shelter addition, no follow-up inspections. The permit officer shrugged. Happens. People build, forget to file updates. Shaq called the police again. Told them everything. The noise, the door, the permit. They agreed to check it. Routine welfare inspection, they called it. But when they showed up, Delaney didn't open the door. Said she was sick. Said they had no warrant. And they left. Shaq stood in the yard, staring at the cellar door from across the fence. Why was she untouchable? Why did the rules bend around her like she'd built them herself? That night, he called a town hall meeting. Not official, just neighbors, just concerned voices gathering in the community center. They filled the small room fast. The air buzzed with urgency. She's blocking the search, someone said. She's got cameras pointed at us, another added. Shaq stood up. Look, I'm not here to point fingers without proof. But I know something's wrong. I heard him. He's close. Somewhere. And that woman's house? It's the only place we haven't searched. Murmurs, nods, then silence. Someone asked, so what do we do? Shaq exhaled. We stay visible. We keep searching. And we keep asking. She wants us quiet. Wants us to doubt. That's how she wins. We don't give her that. When he left the center, the wind had picked up. Leaves scattered across the pavement. He walked home with a renewed sense of purpose. But when he reached his porch, something stopped him cold. Taped to his door was a photo. A blurry, low-res image, clearly printed from an old phone. Kingston, alive, somewhere dimly lit, laying on what looked like stone or concrete. His eyes open, alert. No sender, just the image. Shaq's breath caught, and across the street, a curtain twitched. The blinds whispered back into place. And the silence deepened, not with peace, but with pressure, as if something beneath the surface was starting to crack. The neighborhood was tired, not in a sleepy way, but in that dragged-out, brittle state where people start to avoid eye contact, like shared concern had worn too thin to hold. Kingston had been missing for almost a week. Shaq hadn't given up, but he could feel the shift. The urgency had softened into discomfort. Neighbors were beginning to look at the ground instead of at him. But then, on a gray Thursday afternoon, a knock rattled Shaq's front door. It wasn't the usual concerned parent or volunteer. It was Leo, 16, wiry, sharp-eyed, and sharper-minded. His dad worked with Shaq on the South Side rebuild crew, and Leo was the kind of kid who didn't say much unless it mattered. Shaq opened the door, surprised. Leo? The boy gave a short nod. Can I talk to you? Alone? They sat in the living room. The leash still hung by the door, untouched. Leo's gaze flicked toward it, then down to his hands. He pulled something out of his hoodie pocket, a small voice recorder, scratched and worn. Shaq leaned in, cautious. Leo's voice was low. I didn't go looking for anything. I swear. This just happened. He explained that his baby sister's monitor had been acting weird for days. Not broken, just noisy. The family lived 2 streets down, just at the edge of the Voss property line. The monitor was one of those older analog models. No encryption, no fancy app sync, just a direct frequency. It was old school tech. And that's what made what he heard even more chilling. I heard talking, Leo said, shifting in his seat. But it wasn't from our house. My parents were asleep. My sister was asleep. I heard a woman's voice, talking to a dog. Shaq frowned. Like someone on a phone nearby? Leo shook his head. No. It was clearer than that. Like she was in the same room as the mic. Like her voice was the broadcast. He pressed play on the recorder. Shaq leaned forward and static filled the room for a few seconds. Then it happened. Who's a handsome boy? Benny, you want your biscuit? Good boy. You're my secret sunshine, yes you are. The voice was warm, maternal, a completely different Delaney Voss than the one who watched the neighborhood with clenched jaw and silent judgment. But what stopped Shaq cold wasn't the voice. It was the bark that followed. He knew it, deep in his chest. It wasn't a guess or an assumption. It was instinct. That single, muffled bark, high-pitched and clipped with a tail-end whimper, was Kingston. Shaq exhaled, slow and heavy. Where'd you record this? Leo tapped the recorder. It loops when it picks up noise. I set it to record the second I started hearing voices on the monitor. I think it's picking up a cross signal. She must be using something analog too. Or it's just interference. Either way, that's her. That's your dog. The silence that followed was thick. Not from doubt, but from how certain it all felt, despite having no physical anchor. Shaq stood and paced. Have you told anyone else? No way, Leo said quickly. My dad doesn't even know. He'd freak if he thought I was spying on the neighbors. He hesitated. But I couldn't not tell you. Shaq sat down again, pressing his fingers to his temple. I appreciate it. More than you know. But appreciation didn't change the facts. Audio wasn't proof, not by itself. There was no visual, no time-stamped footage, no confirmation that Kingston was actually in Delaney's house. The signal could have bounced. The voice could be mistaken. At least in the eyes of anyone who wanted to disbelieve. And that's exactly what would happen if he took this to the police. He knew how this town worked. The name Voss still carried a weight that stretched past her porch and straight into the police department. Her late husband's shadow loomed too large. No one wanted to poke that ghost. Shaq tried anyway. He brought the recording to Officer Jenkins, one of the few cops who still met his eyes when they passed on the street. Jenkins listened, twice. His brows furrowed, his lips pressed tight, but when the recorder clicked off, his response was careful. I believe you believe it's him, he said, but unless we can trace the signal directly, or place the dog there with clear evidence, it's just hearsay. It wouldn't hold in court. So we're supposed to wait until she what? Releases him? Buries him? What? Shaq's voice was rising, frustration creeping out. I get it, Shaq. I do. But there are rules. We can't force entry. We can't surveil her property without a judge's order. And given her standing in the community, Shaq didn't need the rest. He stood and left without another word. That night, the tension took on a new shape. Shaq didn't sleep. He didn't even try. He sat on the porch with the recorder playing on loop through an old speaker, daring himself to miss something, to find a pattern in the static. Leo returned the next evening with a new update. He'd rigged a more sensitive receiver. Nothing fancy, just a hacked-together setup from old radio parts, and a discarded antenna. We can't listen live, he explained, but it logs signals stronger than ambient noise. I can set it to trigger if the same voice hits a certain range again. Shaq nodded. Do it. The next day brought nothing. The one after that, silence. But on the third day, the recorder caught a second clip. This time, there was more. The voice. Again. Delaney's, calm and sugary. Oh, Benny. You silly boy. Don't scratch. That's a bad habit. Let me fix your collar. There, that's better. Let's keep you nice and hidden. Hmm? Then the unmistakable tink of a tag hitting ceramic. Kingston's tag. Shaq would have known that sound in his sleep. He had known it in his sleep for months. It was his alarm clock before sunrise walks. Now it was a haunting echo. This time, Leo's recording had a faint background sound too. A low mechanical hum, faint at first, but growing louder toward the end. Like air through a vent, or maybe a fan underground. Shaq's jaw clenched. It's real. It's him. I think she's keeping him somewhere with insulation, Leo said. That's why the barks are muffled. Maybe under her house. The storm cellar? Shaq didn't respond. He was already picturing it. The cellar door he'd seen tucked behind her rose bushes. The one that looked more rusted than used. The same one that made his stomach twist the night he heard Kingston bark. Still, they couldn't act on a hunch. Not legally. Not with Delaney's wall of legacy shielding her. So Shaq turned to the only option left. Public pressure. He called another meeting at the community center. Same folding chairs. Same coffee pot. This time the turnout was even bigger. Leo stood at the back with his headphones and set up. Shaq stood before them, the speaker in hand. I want you to hear something, he said. He played the audio. Then the second clip. Then he told them what Leo had found. He didn't accuse. He didn't rage. He just told them the truth. And let the sound of Kingston's bark do the rest. When the second clip ended, the silence in the room wasn't passive. It was charged. Eleanor stood first. That poor dog.
Angela followed.
If we know she's hiding him, why is she still allowed to shut us out? Because she was Delaney Voss. But even her name was beginning to lose its grip. Someone said, what if we organize a petition, make a formal request to search, or pressure the city council, said another. Make it a public safety concern. Leo stepped forward. If we can prove she's intercepting frequencies, that's an FCC violation. We might not need animal control. We might need tech regulators. By the end of the night, they had a list of signatures, a set of tasks, and most importantly, a shift. Delaney's silence was no longer safety. It was suspicion. But she didn't flinch. The next day, a handwritten note appeared on Shaq's porch. No envelope. No name. Just 8 words. Careful what noise you make with ghosts watching. And across the street her porch light flicked on. Then off. Then, on again. Like a signal. Like a warning. But Shaq didn't back down. Not now. The sound of Kingston's bark was all the proof he needed to keep going. The letter arrived on a Sunday. Not with the usual bills or community coupons, but alone, folded neatly in a yellowing envelope that had no stamp, no return address, no seal. It wasn't mailed. It was placed, deliberate, silent, and it waited like a heartbeat in Shaq's mailbox, tucked behind a local hardware store flyer and a credit card offer he would never open. He almost didn't see it. The envelope blended in, unassuming, but when he reached in, something about the paper's texture, thicker, slightly coarse, made him pull it out. He stood at the curb, fingers trembling before he even unfolded it. Something about it felt final, like the kind of truth you don't get to unknow once it finds you. The handwriting was shaky, cursive, the kind that belonged to an older hand used to writing in long loops and deliberate lines. She took him. There's a hatch in her cellar. Don't call the cops. They'll protect her. Wait till she leaves for church. Go in.
That was it.
No signature, no date, no explanations. Just an accusation, a directive, and a time. Shaq read it again, and again. The words didn't change, but the feeling behind them grew heavier each time. He sat on the porch with it, the sky beginning to bleed from black into soft morning blue, birds stretching their wings somewhere far off. Unseen, his mind reeled. Who had written this? Someone from the neighborhood? Someone who had seen more than they could admit publicly? Was it Leo? No, not his handwriting. And Leo would have said it to his face. Was it a neighbor too afraid to speak up? A witness with no name? The possibilities circled like flies around a wound. But the message was clear, and it landed on his chest with the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. She took him. It wasn't new news, not really. He had felt it in his bones for days now. In the quiet tension that built every time Delaney turned her cold eyes toward him. In the sound of Kingston's bark caught in a stranger's audio feed. But now it was in writing. It was confirmation, and it came with instructions. Don't call the cops. Wait till she leaves for church. Go in. Shaq's first instinct was to crumple the note and throw it away. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't the type to sneak, to break, to cross lines without permission. Even when he knew justice had a way of hiding behind doors labeled private property. Still, he wasn't that man. Or hadn't been. But now, he looked across the street. Her house sat still and smug in the amber light of morning. Curtains drawn, porch empty, but even in silence, it spoke volumes. The same house that had mocked him with photographs. The same house that had refused to open its yard to the search. The same house where the only remaining sounds of his dog had come from. He unfolded the note again, hand still shaking. Go in. Shaq sat there for an hour, eyes fixed on her door, on the slight sway of her porch swing, as the wind tickled past. He tried to justify, to reason. Maybe the letter was a trick, a cruel prank. Maybe Kingston had never been there at all. But that bark, that voice, they weren't fiction. And now, with this anonymous note, everything had narrowed to a single point. She took him. By mid-morning the town began to stir. Church bells rang 2 streets down, their familiar chime rolling gently through the air, like a song from an old record. Shaq stood slowly, the envelope still in his pocket, fingers brushing its edges, as if to make sure it hadn't disappeared. He watched from the corner of his porch. He didn't know exactly when she left, but he knew her routine. Every Sunday, 10:30 a.m. sharp, Delaney walked down the path in her pressed gray coat, wide hat tilted just enough to block her eyes, and slipped into the passenger seat of a dark sedan. The driver, always the same clean-shaven man with city plates, never spoke. She didn't either. She just got in, and they disappeared down the street. And like clockwork, the car pulled up. Shaq's breath caught as he watched her step out. Her expression was unreadable. As always. Calm. Efficient. She didn't glance toward his house. Didn't acknowledge the neighborhood. She just walked, stiff and sure, into the car, and it rolled away, disappearing into the light dust of pollen that danced in the spring air. He waited 5 full minutes. Then he crossed the street. His feet felt heavy, like each step came with a question he couldn't yet answer. What if she came back early? What if the letter was bait? What if he was wrong? But the sound of Kingston's bark lived too vividly in his chest to let him turn back. He reached her porch. The gate creaked as he pushed it open. No alarm. No movement. Just the low groan of old hinges and the soft crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. The house, so manicured and pristine from the outside, suddenly felt lifeless. The windows were eyes that no longer blinked. The walls pressed in with expectation. He walked around to the side, toward the rose bush, the same one that had guarded the rusted cellar door days ago. And there it was, still closed, still rusted, but this time, not locked. His hand hovered over the handle, just for a second. The metal was cold, heavy. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the weeds around it had been recently trimmed, and the faintest scuff marks, too clean, too deliberate, lined the path around it. He pulled. The hatch groaned open, the hinges screaming softly as the door gave way to a steep concrete stairwell. The air that rushed out was musty, damp. It smelled of earth, of stone, of something old being held where it didn't belong. Shaq stood at the top of the stairs, heart pounding, legs frozen. He could still turn back, call someone, wait. But that note, she took him. His hand tightened on the flashlight, and he stepped down into the dark. The stairs creaked under his weight, every footfall echoing louder than it should. He reached the bottom, rough stone underfoot, walls lined with faded plaster and old shelves stacked with forgotten cans and rusted tools. It looked like a storage space, maybe once meant for storms, maybe abandoned. But then he heard it. Soft, familiar, a whine. His head snapped toward the sound. To his left, a half wall stood between him and a deeper section of the basement. He walked toward it, heart in his throat. Just past the corner, another set of shelves had been pushed aside, clumsily, like they'd been moved and reset too many times. Behind them a narrow doorway stood, barely wide enough to pass through. He stepped closer. The whine came again. And this time, it was unmistakable. Kingston. Shaq's breath broke. He dropped to his knees, hands shaking, and crawled through the tight opening, flashlight beam bouncing against the walls. A few feet in, the space opened slightly. A small, crude room dug into the foundation, the floor lined with old blankets and broken pieces of ceramic bowls. And in the corner, curled up, fur dirty and thinner than it had been just a week ago. "Kingston," Shaq whispered. The dog lifted his head, slowly, weakly, and wagged his tail. Shaq fell forward, arms around him, breath ragged. Kingston licked his hand, a whimper of relief escaping his throat. They stayed there for a moment, man and dog, in the silence that finally made sense. Then Shaq stood, carrying Kingston in his arms. He climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. The door creaked open into daylight, and as he stepped out onto Delaney's porch, a sound caught his ear from the end of the block. A car, pulling back in. He turned his head. Delaney Voss, standing at the curb, watching, expressionless, and Shaq, still holding Kingston, heart pounding, truth blazing in his chest, stepped off her porch and onto the sidewalk. The morning air had never felt heavier, and this story was far from over. The door clicked behind him, with a sound too soft for what it meant. Shaq didn't flinch. He stood still at the top of the cellar steps, the light from above casting long shadows over the stairwell like claws stretching downward. The air smelled like damp plaster and the sour tang of bleach, sharp enough to sting the inside of his nose. He didn't speak, didn't breathe too loud. This wasn't the kind of silence you broke with words. Kingston was in his arms, lighter than he remembered, ribs pressing too sharply against his hand. The dog whimpered softly but didn't struggle. He just lay there, trusting him, believing he'd be carried out and away, like he always had. Shaq set him down gently on the softest patch of dirt near the door and grabbed his flashlight again. He wasn't done here. Not yet. The cellar was deeper than it had first appeared. Not just a pit under the house, but a maze of narrow hallways cut roughly through concrete and old stone. The walls were uneven, patched in places, cracked in others, giving the whole place a look that was half shelter, half forgotten bunker. But what made Shaq's skin crawl wasn't the construction. It was how clean it was. Not polished, not new, just scrubbed, bleached, over-sanitized in a way that felt obsessive. He moved slowly, the flashlight beam trailing across shelves, lined with old mason jars, sealed tins, yellowed books that had warped from humidity. The deeper he went, the colder it got, like the walls themselves were pulling heat from his skin. Then, the hallway opened into a square room, and everything shifted. On the far wall, lit dimly by a flickering hanging bulb, were rows of framed photographs, dozens, neatly hung, perfectly spaced, covered in a thin layer of dust. Black and white portraits. All of them. All of black men. Some old, some recent, most of them unfamiliar. But the labeling, that's what made Shaq's stomach twist. Each photograph was marked in red ink, the same ink from the photo Delaney had once slid under his door. Above one frame, loiterer. Another suspicious. A third. Trespasser. Threat. Possible gang affiliation. Uncooperative. Some had dates scribbled underneath. Some had nothing but one word, written hard enough that the ink had bled through the frame's paper backing. He stepped closer, the silence in the room wrapping tight around his throat. The photos were artfully arranged, like a gallery exhibit, one person's obsession framed as justice. And then there it was, his face, a photo of him, taken from the same porch he'd walked across 100 times. Kingston was in his arms, mid-step, his expression calm, neutral, even gentle. The caption beneath, instigator. Shaq stepped back, pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't just about a dog. It never had been. Delaney had been watching him from the moment he moved in. Not just watching, collecting. This was a museum of paranoia, a curated archive of imagined threat. Every portrait was a sentence, a judgment without trial. And now he knew what she'd wanted. Kingston wasn't just taken out of malice or loneliness. He was bait, a trigger. She'd wanted Shaq to come unhinged, to lash out, to break, and give her the ending she needed to frame him exactly how she saw him. Another entry in her private exhibit of fear. But he hadn't snapped. He'd searched, waited, asked, and when it failed to unravel him, she escalated. Now he was here, in the belly of her delusion. He turned and scanned the rest of the room. In the corner sat a metal desk, clean and precise. On top of it, a leather-bound notebook lay open, ink fresh on the last page. He stepped closer and read. He keeps walking by with that dog, trying to appear harmless. It's all calculated. They learn to smile first, like camouflage. But the dog is just a mask, a tactic. I see through it. I won't be fooled again. Shaq flipped through the pages. Dozens of entries, all dated, all about him. Some about others, long gone, maybe long dead. All filled with suspicion, assumptions, shadowy interpretations of harmless acts. He didn't feel fear anymore, just clarity. This was about her past, the one she never spoke of. The legacy of a husband who had once wielded a badge like a sledgehammer, who'd fed her a steady diet of control and fear, and righteousness. After he died, she didn't unravel. She simply took over the role. Judge, jury, and now, curator. He turned away from the desk. Kingston let out another soft whine. Shaq moved to him quickly, kneeling, brushing the matted fur from his face. "It's okay," he whispered. "I got you. We're going home." He carried him back up the stairs, slower this time. Every step felt heavier now that he'd seen the whole picture. By the time he reached the top, the air outside had shifted, still morning, but sharp with the scent of something changing. He walked back into his own yard, locked his gate behind him, and sat on the porch with Kingston in his lap. The dog rested his head against Shaq's chest like he hadn't done in weeks. Across the street, Delaney's porch was still empty, but not for long. He didn't know what would happen next. Not exactly, but now he had evidence. He had the photos, the notebook, the truth, and most importantly, he had stayed calm, stayed human. Delaney Voss had wanted a snap. She got a rescue, and for the first time since all of this began, Shaq felt something shift in his chest. Not victory, not relief, but clarity. It wasn't just about Kingston anymore. It was about being seen for who he truly was. Not through the warped lens of fear, but in full, patient truth. He looked down at the dog in his arms. "We're gonna finish this," he said softly. But not their way. Our way. And across the street, behind the blinds, a shadow moved, watching, still trying to hold the story. But the story no longer belonged to her. Go in. No one claimed responsibility for leaking it. Not then. But it spread fast, and people started to read between the lines. Then came the audio. Leo uploaded the first clip, the baby monitor recording, to a private link. He didn't post it publicly. Instead, he sent it to 5 trusted neighbors, who forwarded it to 5 more, and within 24 hours, nearly everyone in town had heard the voice. "Oh, Benny, you silly boy." Then the bark. Kingston's bark. Unmistakable. Leo didn't hide in the background, either. On Thursday, he stood at the entrance to the park during a neighborhood picnic, holding his speaker in one hand and a printout of the frequency map in the other. "I didn't make this up," he said plainly. "My sister's monitor caught it, and if you've ever heard that dog before, you know who it is." A few people applauded. Some just nodded, tight-lipped. And just like that, the lines started forming. They weren't loud. Not at first. But you could feel the division in glances. In who crossed the street, and who didn't. In who started asking questions, and who avoided them entirely. There were those who clung to Delaney's version of the story. Who said she was old, harmless, a widow. Who remembered Chief Voss in the way he used to stand tall in his uniform during parades. But more and more, people began to remember what came with that uniform. What followed behind his badge. The kids who got talked to a little too harshly. The quiet expulsions. The whispered warnings. And for every neighbor who muttered, "Well, maybe she meant well," 3 others asked, "Then why lock him up? Why lock?" Shaq said nothing through it all. No statements. No social media posts. Not even a yard sign. He just walked Kingston down the street again, leash steady in one hand, a polite nod to those who watched. He didn't speed up. He didn't avoid the sidewalk in front of her house. He just walked it, quiet, resolute, exactly as he always had. And that, more than anything, turned the tide. The calm, the restraint. That's what people noticed. One afternoon, a small boy, maybe 10, no more, knocked on Shaq's door. His shoes were muddy, and he clutched a folded piece of lined paper in both hands. He didn't say a word, just handed it over and ran. Shaq opened it slowly. In pencil, barely legible, were the words, "Thank you for not yelling. My dad says that's real strength." Shaq read it twice, then sat on the porch for a long time, the paper folded neatly in his hand. That evening, things shifted again. Someone, no one knew who, placed copies of the red ink photographs in every mailbox along Mulberry Lane. Not all of them, just 3. Selected ones, blurry, low-light images of the portraits Shaq had seen in Delaney's cellar. The captions were visible. loiterer, threat, instigator. And below each photo, in bold block letters, how many stories does she get to write? That night, Delaney's porch light stayed off, and for the first time in weeks, no curtain moved behind her blinds. By Saturday, it was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. People started showing up in Shaq's yard. Quietly. No fanfare, just knocking, asking if he needed help. If he needed groceries. If he'd consider coming to the next council meeting to speak. "I'm not here for revenge," he told them. "I'm just here for truth." Some nodded. Some cried. And in the background, Kingston wagged his tail, thinner but healing. Later that evening, Angela from down the street brought over a loaf of bread and stood in the doorway a long time before she finally said, "I used to be scared of her, not because she ever did anything to me, but because of the way she could make you feel wrong, just by looking at you." Shaq nodded. "You're not alone. She had all of us convinced we had to shrink around her. And then you didn't." "I didn't want to fight her." Angela tilted her head. "Exactly." That night, Shaq sat on the porch with Kingston again. The town wasn't healed. It might never be. But it was moving, unfolding, making space. He looked across the street. Her lights were off. Her car was still. Her presence, the looming rigid force that had once monitored every inch of his life, had receded. But this wasn't over. Not until truth sat in the open air. Not until no one had to whisper again. The story broke wide on a Tuesday morning, not from a local outlet or town gossip, but from a national headline that caught fire within hours. "The man who answered hate with quiet." The article featured a photo of Shaq sitting on his porch, Kingston asleep at his feet, the leash coiled loosely in his hand. He hadn't known the photo was taken. He didn't know someone from the local library's community blog had sent it to a journalist friend in Chicago. He only found out after his phone buzzed more times in an hour than it had in the past year. The words in the article were simple, but precise. It recounted the whispers, the dog's disappearance, the denied search, the audio clips. But what made it echo past state lines wasn't the drama. It was the restraint. The man never shouted. It read, he never cursed. He never accused without reason. He simply walked, and in doing so, reminded a town and a country that dignity doesn't require noise. By the end of the week, major outlets had picked it up. A viral tweet captioned his porch photo with 6 words that struck a nerve. He found grace where fury waited. Another tagged it, "The millionaire who spoke with silence." And that part, the millionaire, caught people by surprise. They learned Shaq had made his money quietly, building mid-sized construction teams, specializing in urban development that included communities rather than displacing them. He wasn't flashy, never had been, but now, people wanted to know more. Why didn't he yell? Why didn't he break the door down the moment he knew where Kingston was? Why didn't he snap when the world seemed to expect him to? When asked in an interview, his answer was plain. "She tried to steal my dignity with my dog, but I walked out with both." The clip went viral within hours, but the story wasn't about Shaq alone anymore. It was about her too, Delaney Voss, the once revered widow of Chief Randall Voss. The woman who had dictated Mulberry Lane with the same quiet grip her husband once wielded from behind a badge. Now, people started looking, asking. An anonymous archive surfaced. Dozens of files, some digital scans, some old typed pages. Reports, all with the Voss name on them. Minor violations. Baseless citations. Most of them against young black men. Loitering. Disturbance. Presence with no just cause. The trail stretched back 30 years. It didn't take long before someone connected the dots to the portraits Shaq had found in her cellar. The media took it further. Documentaries were proposed. A podcast began production. The truth that had stayed sealed behind her curtains now flooded the streets she once watched like a sentry, and she couldn't stop it. By the second week of national attention, Delaney packed up her house. She didn't say goodbye, didn't offer a statement. She simply vanished, like smoke curling into wind. Someone from the neighborhood said her house was up for sale by a third-party broker. Another claimed she moved to a retirement villa 3 counties over. No one knew for sure. But what everyone did know was this: the name Voss no longer held power. It held questions, unease, and eventually silence. The town changed slowly at first. The cameras on the street corners were redirected. A few fences came down. Sidewalks once avoided began to feel like part of the same ground. Shaq never asked for a parade. Didn't want one. Still, change came to him. Bit by bit, a group of kids started showing up on his front lawn every Saturday. Not organized, not told, just drawn, like children always are, to kindness and soft places. Kingston would wag his tail, trotting between them like a host welcoming guests. They'd play catch, run races, lie in the grass with heads resting against his side. Eventually one kid, Liam, age 7, gap-toothed and always barefoot, started calling it Kingston's Park. It caught on. A hand-painted sign appeared one day, staked in the corner of Shaq's yard. "Welcome to Kingston's Park, for all who play gentle." He left it there. Didn't touch it. The council voted a few weeks later to rename the adjacent alley, once known as Voss Lane, to Kingston Way. It passed unanimously. In a town where nothing moved quickly, that was lightning speed. Shaq continued his walks. No longer watched. No longer questioned. Just seen. Greeted. Welcomed. Some strangers visited, now and then. Quiet visitors from cities far off. Journalists. Activists. People with eyes heavy from watching too much unfold the wrong way, who just wanted to say thank you. One woman, maybe in her 60s, left a note under his doormat. "I teach boys who are told they must roar to be heard. I'm going to teach them your story instead." Sometimes he'd sit with Kingston under the porch awning, sipping coffee, listening to the wind move through the trees, and wonder how something so cruel had turned into something so wide-reaching. But he never glorified it. Not to himself. Shaq knew what it had cost. The hours of doubt, the isolation, the weight of needing to prove his humanness before he could grieve a pet. But he also knew the beauty of choosing not to fracture. He remembered the letter still tucked in his drawer, from the boy who wrote, "Thank you for not yelling. My dad says that's real strength." That letter meant more to him than any headline. One afternoon he invited Leo over for lunch. The teen was older now, sharper than ever, but still soft-spoken. They ate sandwiches on the back deck, Kingston curled up nearby, breathing slow and even. "I never told you," Shaq said, "how much you saved everything." Leo smiled. Awkward. "I just hit record. You also told the truth," Shaq replied. "In a world that teaches people to keep their head down." Leo looked away. "I only did it because you didn't yell. That's how I knew you were telling the truth. That you were real." Shaq didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Across town, a mural was going up. An artist from the next city over had volunteered to paint it on the side of the community center. The sketch, made public beforehand, showed Kingston lying peacefully beneath a tree. Above him, children played, and behind them, faint but powerful, the outline of a man standing watch, not with arms crossed or fists raised, but simply present, calm, upright, whole. Shaq hadn't seen it in person yet. He planned to wait until it was finished. But Angela sent him a picture, captioned simply, "Healed ground." Delaney's house sat quiet now, still for sale. A few buyers had passed through, but none stayed. The blinds remained closed. But there was no one behind them anymore. No story being written from shadows. Just echoes. And across the street, Kingston barked short, playful, free. Shaq stood and opened the door. The morning sun stretched across the lawn. A few kids waited with a tennis ball, already calling Kingston's name. He smiled, stepped outside, and walked across his grass, where no one watched from window, and everyone belonged. When the porch was quiet again, he leaned back in the chair, watching the golden strip of sky melt into dusk. Then, for the first time, he spoke his truth aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the sky, to the street, to whatever needed to hear it. Sometimes peace ain't loud. Sometimes it's just a man, a pup, and a porch that don't judge. And in that moment, the breeze carried nothing but ease. No eyes behind blinds. No shadows on the lawn. Just the sound of children laughing. And a dog, free in every way that mattered. Some stories don't need to shout to be unforgettable. If this one stirred something in you, don't scroll past. Pass it forward. Share it in quiet rooms and loud ones. Because sometimes, the loudest change starts with someone choosing not to rage, but to remain.